Since the earliest days of gaming, visual effects have been a central part of enhancing the gaming experience and providing visual feedback to the players. Some games use minimal VFX, while others try to make a statement. Regardless, VFX are a key part of a game's visual identity. Over the years, I've spent countless hours finding a visual style for Project Bloom, and today I'd like to share some of the tricks I've learned along the way for making impactful VFX as a solo developer. The hardest part of making effects for games isn't playing with the Unity settings. There are plenty of tutorials for that. It's actually creating the right textures and shaders for those effects. So I'll just say this up front. I 100% utilize the Unity asset store for finding pre-made particle effects. Then inside of the engine, I strip them apart into their components and make new effects. I basically use the effects found in the asset store as a large library of high quality and professionally made materials. The majority of the assets that I use come from Hovel Studio or Crypto 289, as they have visual styles that blend well together and most importantly match the style that I'm looking for. With that out of the way, before we talk about modifying or creating particles, we first need to understand what makes a particle. A fire particle, for example, is typically composed of a fire texture, some sparks, a bit of smoke, and a glow effect. Basically, at its core, every particle is made out of a base texture, and then you combine that with numerous subcomponents to create a big effect. Take some time to study the assets you've purchased. Focus on how the subcomponents are layered together to make interesting effects. You also want to look for components that may be useful for your own effects. I find that the more abstract and general the subcomponents are, the easier they are to repurpose. When creating a new particle effect, I personally start by imagining the effect in my head based on what I'm making, like a flamethrower for example. Then I'll add the pieces together until it looks okay. I'll be honest, imagining the effect is probably the hardest part since particle design is almost like an abstract art. How do you convey something like a taunt as a particle effect? Well, this is where I heavily rely on other games for references. I typically try to find two examples. The first is usually from a Square Enix game like Octopath or Final Fantasy XIV, just because of personal preferences, and the other is a game with a much more simple particle design like Pokemon. Pokemon has a massive library of moves, so a lot of the particles need to be minimal and to the point. They convey what is happening in the simplest way possible, especially during the 2D era. So I take the ideas from something like Pokemon, with the extra flair from another game like Octopath, and make effects that are simple yet effective. That's really how I make more simple VFX like generic hit effects and a taunt particle. So now that I have an idea of how the particle should look, now I need to figure out how to actually make it. If you're lucky, you'll find a particle that matches your vision right out the box, and don't really need much modification. But that's not always the case. You'll often have to tweak some parameters. As mentioned before, there are numerous tutorials that go over each and every one of these settings in detail, but the modules that I play with the most are the over time effects, namely velocity, color, size, and rotation over time. As the name implies, these settings change the parameter's properties over its lifetime, so you can use these settings almost like particle animators. You can make particles grow, shrink, go transparent, or rotate over its lifetime. Also, the velocity over lifetime module has a really fun feature called orbital velocity, which is basically how you get a particle to spin around an axis and allows for really fun effects. It's one of the core features I used to make this fire tornado. Now, all this information probably isn't very groundbreaking or revolutionary because truthfully, I don't think I'm doing anything that special. But there is one secret ingredient that I always add to the end of every particle, and it wouldn't be Project Bloom without it, and that's effect lighting. Proper use of lighting can really bring everything together and adds that extra impact to the effect. Few games do this better than Octopath. The vast majority of the skills in that game utilize lighting in a way that is, in my highly biased opinion, unrivaled. From what I could gather, they use a number of light sources in a scene to highlight their effects. At a minimum, it's at least a point light and some other light source to light up the environment. It's hard to say exactly how they did it, but the way I managed to replicate the effect in Unity is by adding one point light and one spotlight to every particle in the game. The point light's job is to highlight the focal point of the effect. It's typically placed a few units in front and above the effect. This gives an immediate glow and shadow effect on the target. The spotlight, however, is meant more for ambient lighting. Its intensity is a bit softer to not overpower the point light, and it hits everything in the scene, giving the particle more impact. Bring those together and you get some pretty good lighting. But there's one more detail about lighting in Octopath, and it's that the lighting is animated. The light's range and intensity changes dynamically to fit the effect. Now you would think you'd have to create some light management system for animating light sources, but really Unity has a built-in convenient way of doing this already. There's one more feature in the particle system I haven't mentioned, and that's the Lights tab. What you can do is create an empty particle with no visuals and enables the light module. Now you can add any light source to it, and the light itself will be affected by the modules found in the particle system, namely its lifetime, color over lifetime, and size over lifetime. By using color over lifetime, you can change the transparency of the light, which will directly affect its intensity. And by changing the size over lifetime, you can dynamically adjust its range. Now you can use these parameters to create and animate different kinds of light effects. Flashbangs, slow buildups, pulsing effects, really whatever you need. And for bigger projects, you can save this light particle effect as a prefab and add it to any particle that needs lighting in the future. Personally, if you take only one thing from this video, it's that lighting really is the secret formula that brings all of my visuals together. It's when I got better at handling light sources that Project Bloom's visuals started to take shape. And it definitely wasn't as easy as throwing lights into a scene. The early days were rough, but with time and experimentation, it eventually got much better. By using pre-purchased assets for their subcomponents, referencing other games, and adding key light sources, I'm able to make the majority of the effects that I want for Project Bloom. If you'd like more behind-the-scenes deep dives into creating Project Bloom, you can check out how I created the Item Effect Manager. Or if you want some meme content about being a solo developer, you can check out my hot takes on being a solo developer. And as always, if you found this video useful, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Additionally, you can wishlist Project Bloom on Steam. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.